You are about to witness the most calculated act of military deception in human history. 73,000 men standing against 85,000, and a battlefield chosen not to defend an empire, but to swallow an enemy whole. At exactly 8 o'clock on the morning of December 2nd, 1805, a dense, freezing fog blankets the rolling hills of Moravia. To the Allied High Command, the French army appeared utterly paralyzed, divided, and ripe for complete destruction. From their elevated positions on the Pratzen heights, the combined armies of Russia and Austria looked down into the mist. They believed Napoleon had made an unforgivable strategic blunder by exposing his entire southern flank along the Goldbach stream. Down in the frozen valley, cloaked by heavy mist, French commanders stood beside their men in total silence. They held strict orders not to light fires, not to shout, and not to fire a single musket until the trap had fully sprung. 24,000 veteran French infantrymen stood motionless in the freezing dawn. They had marched over 50 miles in 48 hours, and now they waited in the damp shadows, listening to the rumbling wheels of Russian artillery moving across the heights. The freezing mist of the Goldbach Valley was so thick a man could barely see 10 paces ahead. It was nature's greatest cloak, hiding 2 full corps of the finest heavy infantry Europe had ever produced, directly beneath the enemy's nose. Up on the high plateau, Allied commanders watched what they believed was a chaotic French retreat. Convinced that victory was already in their grasp, they ordered 40,000 infantry to abandon the high ground and strike the exposed French right. Column after column of Russian and Austrian troops marched down into the valley floor. They were abandoning the single strongest defensive position in Central Europe, completely unaware that their movements had been predicted to the exact minute 2 days prior. General officers checked their pocket watches in the quiet gloom of the valley. Every minute of Allied movement drained the enemy's center of reserves, turning a fortress of high ground into an empty, undefended void, waiting for the counterstrike. Muskets were primed and bayonets locked into place without a sound. These French veterans knew that their survival and the fate of the entire empire depended on absolute discipline. One stray shot could ruin the greatest ambush in military history. On the tactical board, the Allied army was committing suicide in slow motion. As their massive left wing pushed toward the southern villages, a deadly 2-mile gap was tearing open right through the center of the coalition line on the Pratzen plateau. And then, at exactly 8:30, the miracle happened. The freezing mist began to roll away like a stage curtain, and a blinding crimson light broke over the eastern horizon. The legendary sun of Austerlitz had arrived to illuminate the battlefield. With the burning sun cutting through the vapor, the French command received the final order. Swords were drawn and battle standards unfurled. The moment of deceptive weakness was officially over, and the masterstroke of the campaign was ready to strike. Rising out of the valley floor, where the Russian reconnaissance swore no French forces existed, 16,000 bayonets began their rapid ascent up the slopes of the Pratzen. The trap had sprung, and the shockwave was about to hit. Looking back toward the high ground they had just abandoned, Allied commanders froze in sheer disbelief. The French were not fleeing toward Vienna, they were storming the heart of the battlefield. But to understand how this happened, we must go back. To understand why 85,000 men were standing on that freezing ridge, you have to look at the map of Europe in the late autumn of 1805. The entire continent was on the brink of total conflagration. 6 weeks before Austerlitz, Admiral Lord Nelson had annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets at Cape Trafalgar. France had completely lost command of the sea, leaving Napoleon with only one path: total domination on land. Bankrolled by millions of pounds in British gold, the Third Coalition was born. King George III had successfully united the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire into the largest military crusade Europe had ever witnessed. From the frozen steppes of Russia and the mountains of Bohemia, 90,000 seasoned soldiers were marching west. 278 heavy siege and field guns rolled steadily along the frozen roads of Central Europe. At the head of this massive alliance rode 2 supreme monarchs, Emperor Francis II of Austria and the ambitious 27-year-old Tsar Alexander I of Russia, eager to win military glory on European soil. Napoleon reacted with breathtaking speed. In late August, he took 200,000 men stationed on the English Channel and marched them 500 miles across Europe in just 5 weeks. It was a logistical miracle. French soldiers marched 30 miles a day through freezing autumn rains, carrying 60 pounds of gear on their backs. They called themselves the Emperor's Legs, outmarching every traditional military timeline established in European history. At Ulm, Napoleon struck first, encircling and capturing 30,000 Austrian troops without fighting a major pitched battle. But while Ulm was a brilliant tactical triumph, it failed to solve the empire's ultimate existential crisis. The main Russian army under General Mikhail Kutuzov had slipped through the net. Kutuzov retreated methodically eastward into Moravia, burning bridges and dragging the French deeper into a hostile winter wilderness far from home. By late November, the Grande Armée was dangerously overextended. French supply lines stretched 500 miles back to Paris through unstable conquered territory. Every mile advanced meant fewer men to fight and more mouths to feed. Horses were collapsing from starvation, winter uniforms were failing, and ammunition reserves were dwindling. French generals knew that their army could not survive an extended winter campaign against two massive continental empires in Bohemia. And then came the most terrifying diplomatic intelligence of the war. Prussia, possessing 200,000 fresh, highly drilled soldiers, was preparing to declare war on France within days, threatening to sever Napoleon's rear completely. Napoleon was running out of time. If he retreated, the coalition would crush him. If he waited, Prussia would cut his throat from behind. He had exactly 1 week to force a decisive battle and destroy both empires. He rode across the barren plateau of Austerlitz in late November, studying every hill, creek, and frozen pond with mathematical precision. He told his staff, "Study this ground well, gentlemen. We shall fight upon it." The stage was set for the ultimate gamble. Napoleon did not just need a victory. He needed an absolute, undeniable masterpiece of tactical destruction that would shatter the coalition in a single afternoon. Stay with us. Among the senior commanders serving in Marshal Soult's 4th Corps was a veteran general of the Republic. He was 48 years old, a man who had earned his golden epaulets through 15 years of relentless frontline combat. Like many officers of the Grande Armée, he carried a fierce, burning ambition into this campaign. He needed to prove his tactical brilliance before the Emperor, driven by the absolute belief that French discipline was completely invincible. On the morning of November 30th, this veteran general rode to the summit of the Pratzen heights. Looking across the rolling terrain, he saw what every trained military officer in Europe would see: an unassailable defensive fortress. The Pratzen Plateau was the geographical keystone of the entire region. Rising 80 feet above the surrounding marshy streams, whoever held this central ridge commanded artillery fire lines across every approach route in Moravia. Under his direction, French outpost pickets immediately established forward observation posts along the crest. He ordered entrenching tools brought forward, fully intending to turn the heights into a bloody bastion that no Russian army could pierce. Then, at midnight on November 30th, an imperial courier arrived at his headquarters tent, covered in freezing mud. He delivered a sealed parchment bearing the red wax seal of the Emperor himself. The veteran general opened the dispatch by the dim light of a tallow candle and stared in total disbelief. The orders were brief, direct, and completely defied every rule of European military warfare he had ever learned. The Grande Armée was ordered to evacuate the Pratzen Heights before dawn, without firing a single shot. They were to abandon the strongest tactical position in Moravia and deliberately give the high ground to the approaching enemy. Under the cover of a freezing winter night, French regiments began their silent descent down the reverse slopes. Officers rode in sullen silence, while veteran sergeants cursed quietly under their breath as they left their fortifications behind. Among the withdrawing ranks was a young line infantryman of the 10th Leger. He had spent 3 grueling days marching across Bohemia, only to be ordered to surrender the high ground to an enemy he had not even seen. On the strategic map, the French retreat looked like utter panic. The entire French center pulled back 2 miles to the west, crowding behind the swampy Goldbach Brook and leaving the heart of the battlefield completely wide open. Inside the Emperor's command pavilion, several divisional commanders voiced their grave concerns. To surrender the Pratzen meant allowing 80,000 Allied troops to look directly down into the French camp and dictate the battle. Napoleon listened calmly to his anxious generals, his face illuminated by the flickering hearth. He gestured toward the map and spoke the famous doctrine: when the enemy is making a false move, we must never interrupt him. The emperor explained his master plan. The retreat was not a concession, but irresistible bait. By giving the Allies the heights, they would convince the young Tsar that the French army was weak, terrified, and preparing to flee. Standing in the dark valley, the veteran general looked up at the deserted ridge, his skepticism transforming into chilling anticipation. The bait had been cast into the freezing night. Now, Europe had to see if the kings would bite. On the freezing evening of December 1st, 1805, 70,000 French soldiers gathered around their campfires. It was the eve of the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation. Soldiers boiled frozen potatoes and shared dry bread against the bitter wind. They were exhausted from weeks of forced marching, yet an extraordinary current of confidence ran through every regiment. General officers walking the lines observed something rare in military history: an army that possessed absolute, blind faith in its supreme commander, ready to execute an impossible tactical maneuver on command. When the emperor rode through the camp after midnight, a soldier lit a bundle of straw. Within seconds, the gesture spread across 3 full miles of front like wildfire. Over 70,000 men lit straw torches, illuminating the Moravian night in a sea of golden flame. Cheers of Vive l'Empereur echoed across the valley, celebrating the anniversary of his coronation. Veterans shouted promises directly to their commander, swearing they would celebrate his anniversary by capturing the artillery of 2 empires before the next night fell over the frozen plains. Across the valley, Allied sentries on the heights stared down at the blazing inferno of light in total confusion. Their commanders immediately assumed the French were burning their baggage train to retreat. On the Russian tactical board, this fiery spectacle was interpreted as the final proof of French collapse. The young aristocrats around Tsar Alexander believed Napoleon was fleeing toward Vienna under darkness. Inside the imperial command tent at 2 in the morning, the final battle order was read aloud. The plan was dictated with the mathematical clarity of a clockmaker setting a lethal gear. Marshal Soult's 4th Corps was assigned the decisive role. While the Allied army attacked the French right, Soult would remain hidden in the foggy valley, waiting for the order to strike. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the south, Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps was completing an almost inhuman forced march from Vienna, covering 70 miles in 48 hours, to reinforce the sacrificial right flank. On the tactical map, Davout's exhausted vanguard slipped into position near the Abbey of Regern in the dead of night, providing the steel backbone that would prevent the right from collapsing. By 4 in the morning, French soldiers extinguished their torches and lay in the freezing mud, checking their dry musket flints in darkness. The entire army disappeared into absolute, breathless silence. A heavy, freezing white fog rolled down from the hills, swallowing the valley like an ocean of milk. Every regiment stood in combat formation, blind in the damp cold, waiting for dawn. Standing in the pitch-black mist at 5 in the morning, the veteran general gripped his saber in the dark. The gamble was set. In 3 hours, the world would change forever. To understand the sheer mathematical genius of Austerlitz, one must examine the physical anatomy of the ground. The battlefield was shaped like a vast, frozen natural amphitheater, tilted gently toward the western marshes. Running along the bottom of the western valley was the Goldbach stream. It was not a grand river, but a marshy, sluggish brook flanked by drainage ditches, frozen peat bogs, and tangled weeping willows. Anchoring this southern marshland were 2 small Moravian farming settlements, Telnice and Sokolnice. These sleepy stone villages, surrounded by low garden walls and wooden barns, were about to become the bloodiest anvils in Europe. Just north of Telnice stood the fortified pheasantry and castle of Sokolnice. Its thick stone perimeter walls and narrow garden gates formed a natural medieval redoubt capable of turning village streets into deadly choke points. Here, Napoleon placed General Claude Legrand's division. Fewer than 10,000 men stretched paper-thin across 3 miles of frozen ground. It was an impossibly wide front for a single division to defend against an imperial army. On the tactical map, this deployment looked like gross military incompetence. A standard Napoleonic division occupied less than 1 mile of front, Stretching Le Grand across 3 miles created gaps wide enough for entire cavalry brigades to gallop through. French commanders on the right knew precisely what was being asked of them. They were not expected to win a glorious tactical victory. They were ordered to absorb punishment, bleed slowly, and hold the enemy's attention at all costs. Behind the low stone walls of Telnice, French skirmishers of the Corsican tirailleurs and third-line infantry loosened their cartridges. They fortified every barn door, loopholed stone farmhouse walls, and barricaded every single frozen alleyway. The tactical arithmetic was chilling. 40,000 Russian and Austrian infantry, supported by 80 heavy artillery pieces, were preparing to throw their entire weight against fewer than 10,000 French defenders, a ratio of 4 to 1. Guarding the extreme southern flank of this trap were the Satschan and Menitz fish ponds. These wide, shallow bodies of water were frozen over with early winter ice, forming a deceptive barrier that would soon dictate the fate of thousands. The ice on the Satschan lakes was barely 3 inches thick, strong enough to bear the weight of a wandering winter peasant, but dangerously fragile under the synchronized stomping boots of infantry columns or heavy iron cannon carriages. Every single detail of this defensive layout was engineered to be an open invitation. Napoleon wanted the Allied generals to look at the southern flank, see the fragile French line, and believe they had discovered an easy path to total victory. Russian scouts patrolling the morning perimeter observed the sparse French pickets around Telnice. They rode back to headquarters with glowing reports, confirming that the French right flank was weak, vulnerable, and completely ripe for encirclement. Inside the snow-covered churchyard of Telnice, a young French infantryman bit open his paper cartridge and poured black powder into the pan. He checked the churchyard gate, knowing that 40,000 enemy soldiers were marching directly toward his position. As the first gray light of December 2nd filtered through the icy fog, the southern stage was completely set. The anvil had been positioned. All that remained was for the Russian hammer to fall upon it. Stay with us. Inside the Russian imperial headquarters at Krzenowitz, aristocratic triumph reigned supreme. The young grandees around Tsar Alexander treated the coming campaign not as a deadly struggle, but as an effortless royal triumph. On November 27th, General Savary arrived at the Russian camp under a white flag of truce. He carried a personal letter from the French emperor, requesting an urgent armistice and a diplomatic summit between the monarchs. The young Russian officers laughed openly at the French envoy. To their eyes, Napoleon's diplomatic overture was unmistakable proof of weakness. The great conqueror of Europe was finally cornered, desperate, and begging for peace. Tsar Alexander refused to meet Napoleon personally. Instead, he dispatched his arrogant young aide-de-camp, Prince Peter Dolgorukov, to deliver the coalition's humiliating terms directly to the forward French lines. On the strategic map, this diplomatic theater was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Napoleon intentionally invited the Russian envoy to his most exposed forward picket lines, orchestrating a complete illusion of organizational chaos. Napoleon met the Russian prince on foot along the snowy roadside, deliberately avoiding his imperial tent. He appeared haggard, exhausted, and deeply anxious, leaning against an unpainted picket fence like a defeated commander. Dolgorukov spoke to the French emperor with haughty arrogance, treating him not as a sovereign, but as a revolutionary upstart. He demanded that France surrender Italy, abandon the Rhine, and restore all royal monarchies. The Russian envoy radiated supreme aristocratic disdain. He had never commanded a regiment in combat, yet he stood in the snowy mud, dictating impossible terms to the greatest military genius of the modern world. Napoleon played the role of the frightened monarch to absolute perfection. He spoke softly, hesitated repeatedly, and appeared visibly overwhelmed by the vast coalition armies assembling along the eastern horizon. Dolgorukov rode away in absolute triumph, eager to inform Tsar Alexander that the French army was in full panic, short of rations, and ripe for an immediate, sweeping flank attack. The moment the Russian envoy disappeared over the ridge, the fearful mask vanished completely. Napoleon turned to his staff with a cold, predatory smile and remarked, "That young man was born to be outwitted." To reinforce the illusion, French forward pickets conducted clumsy, disordered retreat maneuvers in plain view of Russian cavalry scouts, deliberately abandoning entrenchments as if terrified of the gathering Allied storm. At the Allied Council of War, Austrian Chief of Staff General Weyrother unfolded his elaborate, rigid battle plan. Old Marshal Kutuzov visibly dozed in his chair, knowing that rigid plans rarely survive contact. Weyrother's plan called for 5 massive Allied infantry columns to march off the Pratzen heights, sweep around the French right, and sever the road to Vienna. It was precisely what Napoleon had designed. By midnight, the trap was fully baited and completely accepted by the Allied monarchs. 2 empires had willingly agreed to play their assigned roles in the most calculated slaughter in European history. Stay with us. At exactly 6 in the morning on December 2nd, 1805, a dull bronze rumble shook the frozen ground of the Pratzen Plateau. General Buxhoden launched 40,000 Russian and Austrian soldiers down the western slopes, marching in 3 colossal columns straight into the freezing fog of the valley below. On the tactical map, this massive troop migration shifted nearly half of the entire Allied combat strength away from the dominant high ground toward the southern marshlands. White-coated Austrian grenadiers and green-coated Russian musketeers tramped through frosted mud, their rhythmic cadence echoing off the hills as brass drums beat the advance through the damp mist. As the descending Allied columns entered the low basin, they plunged into a wall of blinding white fog that swallowed individual regiments and muffled visual communication completely. Behind the stone walls of Telnice, French pickets listened to the terrifying, growing thunder of thousands of approaching boots, checking their musket locks in the freezing darkness. French commanders along the thin southern line stood with drawn sabers, knowing they had to hold off a force 4 times their size for 3 agonizing hours. At 7 o'clock, the first Austrian skirmishers under General Kienmeyer emerged from the mist, spotting the low stone walls and thatched cottage roofs of the village of Telnice. From every barn window and vineyard wall, French skirmishers opened a blistering musketry volley, cutting through the freezing dawn air and halting the Austrian advance guard in its tracks. Allied commanders deployed additional regiments, pushing heavy assault columns through the muddy drainage ditches as thick white gun smoke began to mingle with the icy morning fog. On the tactical board, the village of Telnice was functioning exactly as an irresistible magnet, sucking thousands of Allied troops into a narrow, brutal meat grinder of street fighting. For an hour, French light infantry contested every garden wall and stone cottage, inflicting heavy delay while trading ground yard by yard with iron discipline and calculated retreat. Frustrated by the stubborn resistance of a single French division, Russian and Austrian generals committed more and more battalions to the southern struggle, ignoring their own center. The outnumbered French defenders executed their orders to perfection, fighting tenaciously, absorbing the crushing enemy momentum, and drawing 40,000 soldiers deeper into the frozen marsh. By 8 in the morning, the southern flank was completely engulfed in combat. The Russian hammer was striking the anvil, leaving the central heights completely stripped of defenders. And here is where things get interesting. 40,000 Russian and Austrian soldiers slammed into the frozen streets of Telnice, expecting a routed army, but finding an unbreakable wall of veteran steel. Behind low garden walls and overturned wagons, General Legrand's defenders met the Russian tidal wave with point-blank volleys, holding their ground against 4-to-1 numerical odds in the freezing Moravian mud. Muskets grew burning hot to the touch as French infantrymen loaded and fired continuously through the smoke. When ammunition ran low, soldiers scavenged paper cartridges from fallen comrades beneath the churchyard wall. On the tactical board, the Allied left wing was compressing into a violent bottleneck. Instead of severing the Vienna road, 40,000 troops became hopelessly entangled in brutal street combat. North of Telnice, Russian columns swarmed against the Sokolnitsa pheasantry, throwing battalion after battalion against the fortified stone manor house, in an increasingly desperate bid for a decisive local breakthrough. Inside the pheasantry orchard, the famous Corsican tirailleurs contested every tree trunk and garden gate. They fell back only when completely overwhelmed, turning every farmhouse into a miniature fortress of bloody delay. The village of Telnice changed hands 3 separate times in 90 minutes. Streets became choked with discarded equipment and dense black powder smoke, yet the thin French lines stubbornly refused to snap under pressure. Just as Legrand's exhausted regiments reached their breaking point, the veteran battalions of Marshal Davout's Third Corps slammed into the Russian flank, having completed a miraculous 70-mile forced march from Vienna. General Freind led his division straight from the march into combat, charging through the freezing morning mist with bayonets leveled, throwing the surprised Russian vanguards backward out of the burning village outskirts. For 2 agonizing hours, the southern sector became a roaring furnace of artillery fire and musketry. Davout's iron discipline stabilized the line, anchoring the French right flank against the weight of 2 empires. Allied staff officers watched in growing disbelief as their massive numerical superiority produced nothing but mounting casualties. The French right flank seemed possessed by demons, refusing to retreat even a single pace further. Men fought knee-deep in the freezing peat bogs of the Goldbach Brook. Ice cracked underfoot, freezing water soaked through wool trousers, yet the struggle raged without a moment of respite across the marshes. An anonymous French line infantryman bit open his 35th paper cartridge, his hands blackened with soot and raw from the cold, firing with mechanical precision into the swirling gray fog across the stream. On the tactical map, the master trap achieved perfection. 5 massive Allied columns were now hopelessly committed to the southern meat grinder, leaving the central plateau of Pratzen completely abandoned and defenseless. At 8:20 in the morning, French commanders checked their watches. The sacrificial right wing had held for 3 brutal hours. The anvil had absorbed the blow. The hour of the hammer had arrived. Up on the Pratzen plateau, Mikhail Kutuzov stood beside Tsar Alexander, watching the massive smoke clouds rising from Telnice. The old general was deeply uneasy, refusing to send his central reserves into the southern fight. But the 27-year-old Tsar was surrounded by reckless courtiers who demanded an immediate attack. They could not understand why 20,000 veteran Russian soldiers were standing idle while their comrades were engaged south. Tsar Alexander rode forward to Kutuzov and demanded, "Why do you not advance, General? We are not on the Empress's field in St. Petersburg, where a review does not begin until all the regiments have formed up." Kutuzov looked at his sovereign with cold, heavy resignation and replied, "Sire, it is precisely because we are not on the parade ground that I am not moving. But if your Majesty commands it, we shall advance." On the tactical map, this fateful imperial order set the 4th and final central column in motion. General Kollerat's Austrian battalions and Miloradovich's Russian infantry began their slow, lumbering descent off the Pratzen plateau. Step by step, the last reserves of the Allied center marched down into the foggy ravine, abandoning the dominant crest. With every yard they descended, the central keystone of the entire European coalition was stripped completely bare. On the strategic board, the fatal gap was now absolute. Between Prince Bagration's northern wing and Buxhoden's massive southern assault lay an empty 2-mile void, completely unprotected by a single battalion of Allied infantry or cannon. The wind-swept summit of the Pratzen Heights was now eerily silent. Abandoned campfires smoked in the frosted grass. Empty artillery positions faced the western valley, and not a single soldier stood to defend the highest point in Moravia. Down on the Zurlin hill, Napoleon lowered his brass telescope and turned to his assembled marshals. Through the clearing fog, he had watched the last Russian battalion step off the crest, exactly as he had calculated 48 hours earlier. The French Emperor turned to Marshal Soult, commanding the 4th Corps, and asked a single, quiet question. "How long will it take your troops to reach the top of the Pratzen Heights from the valley floor?" Soult glanced down at his pocket watch and replied with absolute professional precision, "Less than 20 minutes, sire. My divisions are concealed in the hollows and ready to march the moment you give the word." Napoleon raised his gloved hand and shook his head with a cold, calculated smile. "Then let us wait another quarter of an hour. When the enemy is making a false move, we must take good care not to interrupt him." On the tactical overview, 16,000 French heavy infantry, under Generals Saint-Hilaire and Vandamme, were coiled like a steel spring in the valley depressions around Puntowitz, completely hidden from the blind Russian staff officers above. In the low valley mist, veteran French line infantry checked their bayonets one final time in absolute silence. They stood shoulder to shoulder in dense assault columns, counting down the final minutes before launching the greatest central attack in military history. At exactly 8:30, the 15 minutes expired. Napoleon nodded to Marshal Soult. Across the valley floor, French drums beat the thunderous pas de charge, and 24 battalions began their rapid, unstoppable ascent toward the empty heights. And this is where the story turns. Out of the vanishing morning fog, 16,000 French heavy infantry surged up the slopes of the Pratzen heights like an unstoppable rising tide. They marched at double-quick time, bayonets fixed, drums pounding the cadence of advance. In less than 20 minutes, the French Fourth Corps was within sight of the deserted crest. The legendary sun of Austerlitz burned away the last wisps of valley mist, illuminating a glittering wall of steel moving steadily toward the empty heart of the Russian army. On the tactical map, the masterstroke executed with mathematical precision. The bold blue wedge drove directly into the undefended void, slicing the Allied army cleanly into two halves. Turning back in his saddle, Tsar Alexander froze in horror. Where Russian reserves should have stood, thousands of blue-coated French infantry were suddenly appearing on the horizon behind them. Kutuzov shouted frantic orders to wheel the fourth column around, desperately crying out, "The heights must be recaptured, or we are all lost." But it was already too late. Austrian and Russian battalions scrambled to reverse direction on the icy slopes, their formations descending into complete organizational chaos under the shock of the sudden French appearance. French line infantry crested the rocky summit of the Pratzen plateau, delivering a blistering, coordinated musket volley into the panicked vanguards of the turning Allied battalions below. For 45 brutal minutes, the summit of the plateau became an inferno of black powder smoke and point-blank musketry, as both sides fought desperately for the high ground. General Saint-Hilaire's division absorbed 3 desperate Russian countercharges, standing firm behind low stone walls and driving the attackers back down the slopes with disciplined cold steel. On the tactical board, the Russian center shattered completely. Column 4 disintegrated under the twin assaults of Saint-Hilaire and Vendôme, fleeing eastward in absolute, uncontrollable panic. French horse artillery galloped onto the summit of the Pratzen heights, unlimbering 20 heavy brass cannons directly along the crest to command the entire southern valley below. From the dominant heights, French gunners trained their artillery down into the rear of 40,000 trapped Russian and Austrian troops struggling in the marshes around Telnice. Russian staff officers watched in paralyzing terror as French cannonballs began tearing into their rear lines. The hunters had become the hunted, completely encircled without a single warning. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the Pratzen heights belonged entirely to France. The battle was won, and the destruction of an entire imperial army was about to begin. By 11:30 in the morning, Napoleon had moved his imperial command post to the newly captured summit of the Pratzen plateau, surveying the fractured battlefield stretching for miles below him. Desperate to restore the center, Grand Duke Constantine hurled the elite Russian Imperial Guard into a ferocious counterattack, sending 3,000 giant grenadiers and cuirassiers surging up the eastern slopes. On the tactical board, the Russian Guard struck the exhausted battalions of the French Fourth Line, threatening to tear open the captured crest and turn the tide of battle once more. French infantry formed desperate squares amidst swirling snow and black powder smoke, struggling to reload their muskets under the thunderous charge of heavy Russian horsemen wielding long, curved steel sabers. From the ridge, Napoleon observed the temporary rupture and immediately unleashed his own personal reserve, the elite French Imperial Guard cavalry, commanded by his loyal aide-de-camp, General Jean Rapp. On the strategic map, the clash of Imperial Guards represented the supreme crisis of the day, as 2 elite armored cavalry formations collided head-on for total dominance of the central plateau. General Rapp galloped forward at the head of the chasseurs à cheval and Mamelukes, roaring the famous command to make the Russian grandees weep beneath the flashing blades of French steel. The collision between French and Russian Guard cavalry was instantaneous and brutal, sending sparks flying from clashing steel blades as horses reared in the frosted mud amidst deafening battle cries. The Russian Chevalier Guards were shattered in 20 minutes of ferocious combat. Prince Repnin was captured, and the elite guard of Tsar Alexander broke into disordered flight across the eastern plains. With the destruction of the Russian Guard, the tactical board showed complete Allied collapse. The center had vanished, leaving 40,000 troops in the southern valley, utterly severed from all communication. Marshal Soult immediately wheeled his victorious Fourth Corps 90 degrees to the south. sweeping along the high plateau to roll up the exposed flank of the trapped Austrian and Russian columns. Looking down from the captured ridge, French line infantry watched the panicked Allied columns below, churning the snowy ground into frozen mud, hopelessly trapped between the heights and the marshy streams. In the southern basin, Russian officers completely lost control of their men. Disordered battalions dropped their muskets and knapsacks, attempting to push past artillery carriages in an uncontrolled surge to escape. The only open path of retreat lay to the south, funneled between the steep hills and the vast, white, snow-covered ice sheets of the Satschan and Menitz frozen fish ponds. As thousands of fleeing soldiers poured out onto the treacherous white ice, French artillery batteries on the high cliffs above began training their heavy brass muzzles directly down upon the frozen lakes. Standing atop the southern cliff of the Pratzen plateau, Napoleon observed the mass of retreating Allied infantry crowding onto the frozen Satschan fish ponds. He turned to his artillery commanders and issued the fateful order: fire directly at the ice. 20 heavy brass 12-pounders erupted in unison, sending solid iron round shots screaming through the winter air. The artillerymen depressed their gun muzzles to maximum decline, walking their fire across the white expanse of the lake. On the tactical map, the geometry of retreat turned into a fatal trap. The narrow dikes between the frozen ponds offered no escape for 40,000 men, while plunging artillery fire bracketed the only remaining southern exit. Heavy iron cannonballs plunged directly into the brittle 3-inch ice sheets. Upon impact, the solid surface shattered with deafening cracks that sounded like subterranean thunder rolling across the frozen Moravian basin. Spiderweb fractures tore across the frozen lakes in seconds. The ice gave way beneath the immense concentrated weight of horses, baggage carts, and thousands of panicked men scrambling desperately to reach the safety of the southern bank. Allied officers could only watch in horror as the frozen ground beneath their boots dissolved into freezing black water. Men discarded their muskets, knapsacks, and ammunition pouches, scrambling claw over claw through the churning ice floes. Dozens of heavy Russian artillery carriages and ammunition wagons broke through the fractured crust, listing slowly into the icy depths. The freezing water swallowed weapons, supply trains, and the last remnants of imperial military pride. Survivors hauled themselves onto the muddy southern shore, shivering violently in the freezing December wind. Their uniforms were caked in black peat mud and ice, their weapons lost, their spirits utterly broken by the catastrophe. Up on the high heights, the French general lowered his telescope with a somber, weighted expression. What had begun as a masterclass in tactical deception had ended in the total, terrifying destruction of an entire imperial army. On the strategic overview, the entire Allied left wing ceased to exist as a coherent military force. Over 20,000 men were either captured, routed, or scattered across the frozen hills of southern Bohemia. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the gunfire over the Satschan ponds gradually subsided into an eerie, frozen silence. Broken sheets of white ice drifted sluggishly across dark, still water beneath the pale winter sky. French line infantry descended to the water's edge, rounding up thousands of exhausted Austrian and Russian soldiers who had surrendered their arms. These shivering prisoners stood in silent disbelief, staring at the conquerors. Surrendering Russian staff officers handed over their ornate golden sabers to French sergeants. The aristocratic arrogance that had defined the coalition command at dawn was completely shattered on the shores of the frozen lake. The winter sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting long amber shadows across the bloodless, smoke-stained snow. The sound of artillery fire faded into distance, leaving behind an empire that had conquered Europe in 7 hours. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the greatest battle of the Napoleonic Wars was officially over. The Third Coalition had been destroyed, and the map of the modern world was about to be redrawn. Stay with us. On the evening of December 2nd, inside a modest post house near the battlefield, the French command sat by candlelight to pen the famous 30th Bulletin to Paris. The victory was total, indisputable, and complete. Napoleon drafted his immortal words to the army. "Soldiers, I am satisfied with you. You have decorated your eagles with an immortal glory. It will be enough for you to say, 'I was at the Battle of Austerlitz.'" The statistical reality of the battle was staggering. The combined Allied armies of Russia and Austria had suffered 27,000 casualties, representing nearly a third of their entire operational strength in Moravia. French cavalry brought in 45 captured imperial battle standards, including the prized silk regimental flags of the Russian Imperial Guard, and 180 heavy brass artillery pieces. Tsar Alexander fled the battlefield in the dark, separated from his staff and weeping openly in the freezing woods. Accompanied only by a physician and a handful of Cossacks, the master of Russia was in full flight. 2 days later, on December 4th, Emperor Francis II of Austria personally rode to a rustic wooden windmill near Palani to meet Napoleon and beg for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Napoleon greeted the Habsburg monarch by the open fire, saying with sharp wit, "I receive you, sire, in the only palace I have inhabited for the past 2 months." Francis replied, "You make such good use of it that it must please you." On December 6th, the Armistice of Austerlitz was officially signed. Under its terms, the Russian army was granted safe passage to evacuate Austrian territory immediately, leaving the Habsburg monarchy entirely alone. On December 26th, the Treaty of Pressburg was finalized. Austria ceded Venice, Dalmatia, and Tyrol, while agreeing to pay an astronomical war indemnity of 40 million gold francs to the French treasury. The geopolitical shockwave destroyed the oldest political institution in Europe. Within 8 months, Emperor Francis abdicated the imperial crown, formally dissolving the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire forever. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, consolidating dozens of fractured German principalities into a unified satellite alliance of 16 states bound directly to the French Empire. In London, the news of Austerlitz shattered British Prime Minister William Pitt. Looking at a map of Europe hanging on his wall, he spoke his despairing final words. "Roll up that map. It will not be wanted these 10 years." Riding across the quiet heights the following morning, the veteran French general looked at the battlefield with profound humility. His initial skepticism had been completely shattered by the sheer geometric genius of the plan. Beside the low stone walls of Telnice, an anonymous French line infantryman cleaned black powder fouling from his musket barrel. He had survived the bloodiest hours of the century, unaware that his steadfast defense had changed the fate of the world. The smoke cleared, the treaties were sealed, and the emperors departed. But the true story of Austerlitz belongs not just to the crowned heads of state, but to the forgotten men who stood in the freezing mud. Stay with us for the conclusion. When military historians analyze Austerlitz, they speak endlessly of imperial genius and the legendary morning sun. But the true architects of victory were the common soldiers who held the freezing mud. General Legrand's division absorbed 40,000 Allied soldiers. Fewer than 10,000 French defenders stood their ground, suffering 2,000 casualties while holding the stone walls of those small Moravian villages. Think about that. For 3 agonizing hours, ordinary infantrymen stood against 4-to-1 odds, knowing nothing of the grand master plan, holding their ground simply because they were ordered to stand. And because those men held Telnice against impossible odds, 40,000 Allied soldiers remained fatally trapped in the southern marshland, unable to advance, unable to maneuver, and blind to their own center. And because the Allied left wing was sucked into that southern bottleneck, the Russian high command ordered their reserves off the heights, leaving the central plateau of Pratzen completely empty and undefended. And because the Pratzen heights were stripped bare, Marshal Soult's hidden infantry surged out of the morning fog in 20 minutes, slicing the coalition army cleanly and permanently in two. And because the Allied center was severed, the elite Russian Imperial Guard was thrown into an unsupported counterattack, only to be crushed upon the crest by the French Guard cavalry. And because the center collapsed completely, 40,000 soldiers were driven onto the treacherous ice of the Satschan lakes, where plunging French artillery fire turned a retreat into an absolute disaster. And because the Third Coalition was destroyed in 7 hours, Emperor Francis was forced to sue for peace on a snowy roadside, ending the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire forever. All of that happened because one commander understood the dangerous power of human arrogance, transforming his own apparent weakness into the most lethal tactical weapon ever conceived in European history. The names of marshals were carved into grand monuments across Paris, but the anonymous line soldiers who held the freezing anvil of Telnice returned to quiet farms, largely forgotten by history. Today, peaceful wheat fields cover the slopes of the Pratzen plateau. A solitary stone peace monument stands on the ridge, overlooking quiet valleys where three empires once collided in the freezing fog. The veteran general who once questioned the retreat realized that the greatest victories are not won by reckless assault, but by the calculated discipline of allowing an enemy to defeat himself. And the next time you study a map of military history, remember that true strength often hides behind apparent weakness. A trap is only invisible when the victim desires victory too much. 73,000 against 85,000, a battlefield chosen not to defend an empire, but to swallow an enemy whole, all because an emperor made his enemy believe they had already won.